Welcome to another episode of the Business Maverick Show. Today we've got change guru Ket Patel here to talk about everything change.
Everything changed. Yeah, cheers for inviting me along. Business Maverick, that's a big title to fill, isn't it?
I know, someone gave it to me actually. I didn't make it up myself, but I guess it is a bit about that sort of constructive disruption that we have to do in our role sometimes, isn't it? It's that agitation for the right reason.
Yeah, and that's you and I met through LinkedIn, I think, and then we did that House of PMO event where we're sort of just sensitively trying to sort of push a little bit what people think is the right thing to be doing when it comes to organisational change. And I think that's it's easy for us as practitioners to kind of go, this is what we should be doing with an organisation. But then actually we need to look at what we're doing ourselves. Are we doing enough? Should we be doing more? Are we positioning it right? And actually are we just getting trapped in our own vicious cycle of saying the same thing over and over again and the message not landing? So we've got to find new ways of saying stuff, right? And seeing if it creates a curiosity. And that's what I like about sort of following some of your things as well. It's like, I've never thought of something in that way before, and it creates a new way of thinking about stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how change management has matured. I was looking through one of my presentations and I've sort of listed about 6 or 7 different methods, and I think the first one was 1947. There was one around about the 1960s, the sort of the 80s, and Cotter in the 90s, and ADCAR came through in sort of early 2006, I think it was. And you look back at some of those and they're very linear, they're very kind of formulaic, deterministic. If we can plan it, we can make it happen. And things have moved on massively, haven't they? I mean, our understanding of people and change has moved on.
But that's the interesting bit. The understanding has, but the theory that we tell people to go and apply hasn't. I don't think. So I've done change management for maybe 10 years as a specific profession. Before I was doing business analysis, project management, bit of operations management. They all require some level of change thinking in your day-to-day. Never done anything like a certification or anything in getting to that stage. And then I did one. I went, oh wow, there's all these models from 40 years ago. When would I ever actually apply one? When would I ever go into an organisation and say, hey, by the way, we're going to do change in these 8 steps? You wouldn't. You'd have a conversation, wouldn't you? You'd say, well, how are you navigating change today? Where are your people stuck? You'd start questioning. You'd act more in a coaching capacity to kind of just understand. And the idea that you can use these models as the foundation for how you would deliver change just seems, from my background as a sort of science mathematics, it just feels alien to be applying it to people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got a science background as well. I used to be my early career was a scientist, immunologist. I think there's an old saying I use many times, which is all models are wrong, some are useful.
Yeah.
I've never looked at one of them and go, that's the holy grail. This is the one that will work. Have I cherry picked a few things and a few ideas from some of them? Have I found other ideas from amazing books and places? Yes, through that process. But there is no one way out there, is there? And maybe that's sort of indicative of the problem, right?
It's weird, isn't it? Because I put a LinkedIn post out and said, sort of, do we really need change models? Kind of my own exploration of why we have them in the first place. And there was some really good feedback around, sometimes they're a comfort for you. Like if I go in and talk to a client and I say, well, look, change, I know that their maturity is always the wrong word actually, but their readiness to kind of think about change is quite low. And so they need something they can hold on to. Model's pretty useful in that, hey, it might work like this. You know in practice it doesn't. So that there's a use there, even if in the back of your mind you know this isn't how change is really going to work. So it gives you the practitioner confidence. But the moment you almost think this is the way it is, you become part of the problem in a way, because you're like, no, we can't deviate from it. And that, as you said, change practices have moved on. Our understanding of how people go through change has moved on through neuroscience and psychology. Actually, we can't be applying these linear processes. Businesses don't work like that. Things change all the time. Things become emergent. And are there models that really cope for that? I don't think there are.
I think it's interesting. I think, your point about do we need something to hang on to? I think when I think about agile methodologies and frameworks, let's call them frameworks, we don't like to call them methodologies, not in the business. But SAFe, for example, the reason SAFe has been so successful is that one pager. Because most execs don't understand what Agile is, and when a coach comes in and says, well, it depends, and it's all about people, but now, SAFe created the one pager. Now I can see what Agile is. This is what it is. Great. Let's do this. But you're right. The point, and we use this in lean terms as well. The sort of, and it's a martial arts thing, isn't it? Shu Ha Ri, which is, Shu is the entry level where you're doing the kata. You're just following the process, you're doing it over and over again. Ha is the next level up, where you start to experiment with what you've been taught to find new ways of doing it, and then Ri becomes the master, where you start to break outside of the model, outside of the martial art, to become that sort of transcendent level almost, and apply it in a completely different way. You become the master and the teacher and creator of new ways through that. And I think there's definitely a piece of that. And this is the problem sometimes with certification. Certification only gets you to a certain stage where you're doing the kata. You can follow the process, paint by numbers, but it doesn't always have the same effect. You need that level of maturity, the master almost, who's been through it and seen it so many times and goes, here's the framework so you can grab hold of it. Oh, you want to buy it? Great. Now we can stick that in the bin. Now I'm gonna apply my knowledge and experience and lots of different tools to see what the situation is, and we'll work our way through from there.
And that is where I think there's this sort of balance of, you need sort of tools to hold a conversation that perhaps gets you in the door or creates interest enough that you can then go and explore with them. Even though the tool is not really what you're selling, it's what is sold and that gets you through the door and has the conversations. But even then, I find it interesting that senior execs, like SAFe's a really good example because I quite like it as a framework, and you see lots of people trying to apply it, but what actually fails is the culture that sits around it to enable it, right? So all these processes are nice if everyone follows them, but nobody follows them. So all of a sudden it fails, and then everyone blames the framework. Well, you're actually like, well, look, we're not actually changing the way we work. So then, and there's often three levels of that. There's sort of, there's the senior leadership team that want this thing to implement. There's the middle layer that need, that have got day-to-day work to do and have been asked to execute this, so they're responsible. And then there's the end users that kind of need to change their way they work and deliver. And somewhere there's some level of what I call treacle in all of that, right? That there isn't a seamless experience for each of those groups, and therefore the whole thing just doesn't work. And all frameworks throughout where you try to create a different speed or way of an organisation operating, it's like top down through to the bottom, it struggles because there's different expectations of what's happening. And I find that's the curious thing about organisational change. Why, over such a long period of time, do organisations still not get that it's a really strong strategic skill to have? We still find ourselves predominantly, my experience is, coming in to fix a specific change issue. And then maybe through an increased trust, we get exposed to bigger and bigger, but we never really get that nirvana of, hey, I understand. If we manage change at a holistic level, we'd have a very different organisation.
So I think that's a really good point, really interesting point, which is, if someone says, how are you going to help me change? The first question probably should be, well, tell me what the culture is, right? Because not all change methods and frameworks will work in all cultures, right? So, and the culture is probably the key thing that determines whether that will be successful or not.
Yeah, and I've been using less the word culture, and I don't know if that's just because of the culture's loaded, I think, and that's the danger. As practitioners, we've been having a conversation, because I do some work with a couple of different professional bodies, where we're talking about how do we assess the context in which we're coming into. So you call it environment. We come into an organisation as it is, and there's a set of leadership behaviours, there's a set of work ongoing, and there's a set of people doing it. And all of that adds up to this environment you find yourself in, trying to affect the change you want. And how do you make that assessment? Like, if you ask the practitioner, they probably would go in, they sort of, they peer into things, they sit in on meetings, they listen to the language. There's no framework for that really, but as you start to talk to people, there's a series of questions people are asking themselves, very much coaching questions, like why? Why do you do that? What's your belief sitting behind that? What happens if you did something different? And so that's where I've been having this sort of interesting sort of side thought around change as a coach, right? Like you come in and you look at what an organization's doing, you look at those different levels, and you see, well, where are they stuck and why are they stuck? And can they see for themselves what they might be able to do differently? And that's not a linear model, right? Because you're looking at very individual cases at very different levels of autonomy within the organization. And I think that in itself is quite complicated. Like I don't really know the day-to-day of a senior exec. Like, you know, all I know is it's very busy and there's a lot of different things spinning around. Same is true all the way through the organization, but the priority is very different. And I find that's quite fascinating to try and get alignment around the change, because you need all three parts of the organization to really be aligned to affect it. And that's kind of an exploration in itself.
So let's think about that executive level, right? And you mentioned earlier about, you know, why have organizations not really engaged change? And some of that's got to sit at the top table because some they handle most of the resources, whether that's money, people, whatever it is, or time. So what's going on there? What do you think's holding that exec level back from really understanding change? Surely most of them in their tenure have been through multiple projects or changes or whatever in organisations that have failed, have fallen on their face, right? And yet they've not learned from that and put something else in place. So what's going on?
I mean, I'll be honest. I think there's probably a couple of things going on, and none of this stuff is ever sort of intentionally not designed to do a bad job. I just think the merit or the reward is founded through something else. So, you know, if you get to a senior position in a business, your job is to do what the rest of the organization needs. And sometimes if you agree to an idea, you've probably made it, you're miles away from perhaps how it will actually get done. And you can oversimplify that, but you've also had a lot longer to think about it. So there's that disconnect between, I think this is a good idea at senior level, let's plow some money into it. I think it would be a lot quicker than it actually probably will be in practice, but the people delivering know that it will take longer and that they've got a lot of other stuff to do at the same time. And so there's almost like a disconnect between the ease at which it can get done and the people doing it. And that's never talked about. I don't think there's a really safe forum for line managers, you know, sort of senior leaders to kind of push back up and say, this is complicated stuff. You know, you're asking us to do more than one thing. And we don't have any more extra capacity. We don't have any extra resource. So how are we going to manage it? And so I also don't think there's often, and again, it goes back to our kind of PMO discussion, I don't think there's a very good heat map of all the change in an organisation that a leadership team can really take advantage of. It's sort of almost, that's a really important thing. We've got to do it. Let's get the funds. Let's get it going. The next thing's a really important thing. And that trade-off, I think, is hard to make if you don't have something constantly in your face saying, actually, if you do that, it impacts this, or there's that cross impact. So I think there's a couple of different things around that.
Yeah, I like your kind of concept, to quote a Tarantino film. It's like a Mexican standoff between the exec and the people on the ground. It's like everyone's like staring each other out. Everyone knows they've got a completely different opinion, but no one's willing to draw first, as it were.
And I do think there's that other thing, right? Like if you've got comfortable with an idea at senior level and you've moved on psychologically, you can also underestimate the psychological change people need to go through themselves when they hear that idea for the first time. So you can not intentionally dismiss their worries and concerns because you've already got your head around it, but you've had time to do that, they haven't. And I think actually thinking back to, I use COVID as a relatively good example where whole organisations moved into sort of this remote working, but senior leaders at the same time as middle managers, at the same time as sort of, you know, employees, all moved into a remote working. Everyone had the same change to deal with, found out at the same time and had to figure out their own way. There was a bit more of a community, a levelling of that. Yeah. That's not how change happens in an organisation often. So I think there's that element that is often lost. We've got a great idea, then it filters down. The time it takes to filter down, time you've got used to it, time others are still figuring it out. And that disconnect doesn't help. It feels like that's where a level of mistrust sometimes is created as well.
Yeah, I like that concept of COVID. It was wholesale need to survive that happened at one point. I mean, literally, we got the message, didn't we, one afternoon?
Yeah.
We're locking down. And everyone, what does that mean?
Well, exactly.
You know, it's like, it's that kind of collective, you know, shock and awe at what on earth does that mean? So it's interesting. Do you think that prompted better change than the change which is that sort of seeping through different people at different places? You know, is that shock? I know not that we always want something like a lockdown or something like that. That's probably not the catalyst that we're looking for. But do you think that worked better as a concept?
I don't know, if I'm honest. I think the one thing we always talk about is how well do we sustain that change, and I think when everyone experiences it for themselves at the same time as everyone else, it can create a level of a community around it. But when we're then, the option to go back is available to us, some people will default to that or prefer that. And then that creates a bit of tension, but it's not often talked about or managed. Actually, I was talking to an organisation that was sort of a start-up bank about a year and a half, first live event I went to actually, where the senior leadership team had appointed someone to be chief sort of hybrid working officer. And everyone in the room sort of laughed because it was sort of, well, we've just made up another chief of. Yeah. But when you heard what this person was saying, which is, this is now an experiment about how do we find the right balance going back. We learned some really good stuff going forward. We've dropped some stuff we didn't really need and thought we did. But somewhere between these two things, we now need a new way of operating, and that isn't obvious. And in fact, it will work well for some people, it won't work well for others, and we've got to balance that as a business. So we can't take any of this for granted. So we regularly set a policy in place because we think that's what people need. We look at how it's affecting, and then we go back and say, does that work for everyone? And we keep doing that. And you know, that to me was like, actually, that's a ridiculously sensible idea. Treat this as another experiment on how do we find the new normal, which is a phrase I hate. I can't believe I've just said that. But yeah, I find that it's not better. It was just different, but it gave you the opportunity to think of a better way for your organisation. Now, how many people are taking that advantage of that is hard to say. Yeah.
I like your point. You know, the shock all happened at the same time. Everyone went, oh, we've got to do something. But I think your point was interesting, which is people's culture and values caused, when they had a bit more freedom, well, I'm going out twice today for a jog, rather than once. You know, I can start to break the rules a little bit and stuff like that. So actually people dispersed and made it less sustainable. Probably that kind of drifted in afterwards.
Drifted away, didn't it? You know, and that was the thing I think is an organisation is in effect a community of people, right, trying to achieve a business outcome. But you don't think of it like that, and the word culture gets thrown around. But it is individual teams trying to affect some change in their part of the organisation. They're not really that well rewarded for working well with others, although it's kind of, you know, we collaborate. And I think this is where it all kind of starts to lose meaning sometimes. And what COVID showed me was organisations can come together. Okay, it took a very significant crisis. They can all learn together and they can all move forward. But if you take that away and give choice without some guidance and continual support, which is what change does. This is the interesting thing, right? Change management for me is about providing people the support they need in order to explore the change for themselves, and then providing them tools and techniques and, you know, ways of figuring it out. If you provide them that and create the community, then all of a sudden change becomes a bit more fun. It becomes a little bit more social, and then all of a sudden it's actually a lot easier than you think. People let go of their fears, but I don't think it's a very process-driven way change is enacted in organisations. We must do this, therefore everyone else get in line underneath, and that is where I think that sort of waterfall effect doesn't work, right? Or at least I don't think it's the best way organisations could necessarily lean on change. Yeah. I don't think we've answered the question though why it struggles at the senior level. If I'm honest,
I don't know. I think there's I think change is commoditized a bit. I think, and I'm talking about the broader change now, you're talking projects and all that kind of stuff as well. So not just change management. I think it is just, well, and it's what drives commoditization, right? Sometimes certification drives commoditization. I don't need an expert, I need someone with that certificate because they now qualified to do that. Doesn't mean they're only good at it, right? You know, so sometimes there's that. So I think it's been commoditized a little bit. And then what does that drive? That drives a a kind of mentality where change is an event, sporadic, ad hoc, turbulent, rather than change as a capability, right? Which means it's normalized and inherent within the organisation. And I think that's one thing that execs are missing at the moment. Is I would want to build an organisation that has change capability within it. It has capability to change continuously, depending on what the outside external forces are, rather than go, oh yeah, we'll pull a change team together when the next crisis happens.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real shift. I think organisations I've seen who are good at it tend to be much more focused on having it as a capability, inbuilt capability.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that execs, and usually is whether execs want to invest in that, right?
That's exactly.
In that kind of capability. But that's probably a bit of a lever, I think, for some execs.
And I was talking to a startup a couple of weeks back where they were sort of just about to go into growth over the next 2 years, go from 40 up to 150. And they were thinking, we've got quite a lot of change coming for our people. We want to try and keep what we've got going sort of in terms of culture and things like that. But we've also need to manage the change well for people. So how can we do that? And it's got me thinking about what's about to happen to that organisation. They're about to, from this really entrepreneurial 40 people who are got their hands on everything, kind of very little structure in the formal sense. They're going to go into a level of structure and into a level of organisation. And the reason they're going to do that is they want predictability. They want to be able to say with some certainty, this is the way things will get done, and these are the people responsible for it. And the problem is that in itself is fine, but what perhaps isn't, and organisations fall into the trap of, is that we will be predictable in everything. The mindset is, I must be predictable. And in fact, it's the opposite. I want you to remain open to uncertainty, but I want you to manage things as predictably as possible. And it's at that point where an organisation starts to grow and they make people think their job is about managing in a predictable way and bringing less risk to business in the operations world, whilst this group over here go and do all the fun stuff and then throw it over the fence. We create this level of friction. And I think, if you're an organisation starting out, it would be great to consider that it's important to separate and create structure, but the mindset of everybody's must be change ready. That's how you build a change ready organisation, an adaptable organisation. For big organisations already there, like you said, there's a balance. How much do you want to invest to have that adaptability? You might only have changes every couple of months, that you want to start out, and you might have the capacity within your organisation to handle that. Or if you've got some measurement to see that, that's okay. But if you're constantly failing and you're starting too many projects and not enough is getting through the front door, then maybe something needs to be done there.
That's back to your point about the heat map. Can I see how much change is actually going on in the organisation?
Yeah. I think that's the thing. It's like you've got to uncover it to know whether you want to do something about it.
It's interesting because SNS is scaling. Now we've got in-house capability to manage change, right? But I look at other companies who aren't in our business. They might be in the business of, I don't know, TV streaming or something like that. And I do sit there sometimes and wonder, how on earth do you manage your change? Because you don't have, you're 40 people. We can't afford a change manager. We can't afford a consultant to come and advise us, right? We just have to kind of bumble through. And I remember talking to one client who'd they'd grown quite quickly to about 150, 200 people through acquisition. They'd done something like 12 acquisitions in the last year. They were going to do another acquisition. They were going to do rebranding. They were going to change all their systems. And they got me an audience. And the person who was worried about this got me an audience with the CEO. And I just said, honestly, your wheels are going to come off the trolley here, right? Quite quickly. There is too much change. I said, you've got lots of people who are in other little mini startups who are very purpose-driven, but they're aligned to the boss of that one, right? And they might not have left yet, but they're looking to go, is this the one I want to be in? Because I want it to be in that one, right? But I'm not sure I want to be in. And you lose identity as soon as you do a rebranding, and all that comes. And then you were doing system change. And he didn't employ us. And then 3 months later, I got a phone call from the person who brought us in. He just went, the wheels have totally come off. Right? I mean, he said attrition's 45% at the moment. I mean, just and these are all the things I predicted that were going to happen. I said, what's your attrition rate? I said, it's quite low. I went, that's going to change. That's going to change quite quickly. So it's interesting is how probably we know the execs know this sometimes, but they just don't give it the importance. And It's a bit of a shame.
I mean, look, I genuinely don't know what the day in the life of the CEO, CFO, COO is, if I'm honest. But I imagine the few that I've worked with, they are so over every minute detail that is in front of them, and they are so tightly packed all day. There isn't really much room to think more deeply. But what there is a level of trust in the people below them that have to execute that needs to come back up and say, this isn't realistic. And that's the conversation I feel is missing.
Right.
Whether it's not happening because the people don't want to give the bad news, or that the bad news just isn't allowed to be said. That to me is that, look, as a senior exec, you can do something about something you know. What you can't do is if it's all happening over here and you're blissfully unaware of it because people won't tell you or you're just not interested, and then it happens, well then, it's on your shoulders, you're accountable. So I do think when that next level of management have got concerns about what's being done, it shouldn't be a free rein to say, okay, all right, we'll slow down. No business wants to slow down. But there is genuine risk perhaps that needs to be heard and incorporated, and then a real holistic kind of assessment made. And I think that's the difference that can be done, because they're the people that do want to succeed. They do want to make these changes, but they just know actually they can't do all of them, right?